London never truly sleeps, but there are nights when it listens. On an October evening, wrapped in cold rain and silence, a man of influence walked down Galowmere Road and never reached the end of it. There was no struggle, no witness, no sound, only a body and a death that no one could explain. I am Dr. John Watson, friend and chronicler of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and this is the account of a case where a man was killed in the middle of a London street, without anyone ever hearing the shot, a case where silence itself became the weapon. And, if you prefer to listen rather than read, this story is also available on Spotify. Chapter 1. A Death Without Violence. The October of that year came to London wrapped in a damp that seemed to leak into the walls of our rooms at Baker Street. I was drying my stockings by the fire when Holmes, already dressed and watching the rain through the sitting-room window, asked whether I had read the third page of the Times. I had not. I reached for it. A paragraph of no great prominence, buried beneath the shipping notices, reported that Mr. Edmund Halberd, a property speculator of some reputation, or the lack of one, had collapsed and died the previous evening on Galowmere Road. The police surgeon had ruled it heart failure. The man was 58, stout, and, the paragraph noted with the delicacy peculiar to such columns, lately beset by matters financial. A natural death, the sort that clears a paragraph and then a memory. An unremarkable notice, I said. Unremarkable, Holmes agreed, reaching for his coat, save that I recognized the name, the hour, and the street, and I distrust all three. Fetch your coat, Watson. We shall walk before the cobblestones are washed. We took a hansom to the Marylebone End and continued on foot. Holmes volunteered nothing of what he knew of Halberd, only that the man had figured at a distance in an affair concerning the coercion of tenants in Suffolk, a small ugliness that had never come to court. It was not, he said, necessary that we suspect foul play. It was only necessary, he added, that we look before the street was made tidy. Galowmere Road surprised me. Though it cuts through a busy district, it is a curious cleft of quiet. 17 houses facing inward, a boarding house at the eastern end, a public house at the western, and along its northern length a long-walled garden that admits neither mews nor tradesman's door. A corridor, Holmes murmured, as though he had been thinking the word for some minutes. A corridor of privacy. The body had been removed. A young constable was stamping his feet at the midpoint, bored and damp, and raised no objection when Holmes went to his hands and knees upon the stones. I confess I watched him for a long while without speaking. I have learned in my years of chronicling these matters that Holmes at work upon a pavement is not to be interrupted, even by a remark about the weather. He moved in a slow spiral from the place the body had lain, his face an inch above the flags, his long fingers brushing the grit with the delicacy of a man sorting moths. He paused twice. The first pause was at a damp darkening near the curb. A walking cane, I was told, had fallen there. Halberd's cane dropped forward as he fell. I marked the oddity of that. A man clutching at his chest in the spasm of a failing heart seldom pitches his cane ahead of him. I said nothing, for Holmes had already seen it and already set it aside, a small frown crossing his features. His second pause was longer. He drew a pair of tweezers from his waistcoat and lifted something from the stones too small for me to discern. He rose with it between his finger and thumb and held it to the grey light. A fibre, he said, wool, black, from the breast of the overcoat. Cut, Watson, not torn. Cut. A tear phrase. A burn blackens. This has been driven cleanly through, as though by a pin. He turned the fibre. A pin, however, does not pass through a woolen coat and then through the gentleman wearing it. One must choose between the two explanations. It was then that I noticed the smell. It was not strong. A passing carriage would have masked it, and a passing carriage, I suppose, had been credited with it by those who noticed at all. It was the faint, hot, unclean smell of oil burnt upon metal, the sort one encounters in the corner of a workshop where a lathe has been running. I mentioned it to Holmes. Yes, he said very quietly. I've been breathing it for some minutes. Tell me, Watson, where is it strongest? I turned my head. To the south, nothing. To the east, the wet smell of the boarding-house chimneys. But to the north, across the road toward the unlit mouth of a narrow alley that interrupted the walled garden, the smell was distinctly, if faintly, thicker. Holmes followed my look. He did not cross to the alley. He only stood and regarded it, as one regards a closed door one intends shortly to open. "The surgeon," he said at last, to the constable. "Has he yet examined the body, or only the overcoat?" "The coat's been sent with him, sir. Proper post-mortem's not till this afternoon." "Then there is time." Holmes turned to me, and in his eyes was that cold, still light I have come to know and to dread. "Watson," he said, "I believe a man has been murdered on this street, and no one, not the constable, not the surgeon, not the dead man himself, has yet realized it." The rain began again as we walked back toward the cab stand. Holmes said nothing. In his gloved hand, wrapped in a square of paper, was a single black fibre no longer than an eyelash. Chapter 2. The Street That Heard Nothing. We breakfasted late, and in silence. Holmes had set the black fibre upon a square of white card beside the marmalade, and glanced at it from time to time as a man glances at a difficult letter he is not yet ready to answer. When at last he pushed his plate aside, he said only, "We shall walk Galowmere Road again, Watson, but we shall walk it among the living this time." We returned in the slate-grey hour before noon. By daylight the street lost none of its peculiar quiet. A coster's cart clattered past the eastern end and vanished toward the Marylebone Road, and the sound of it did not carry as it ought. Holmes stopped at the curb and lifted his head like a man tasting the air of a cellar. "Listen," he said. I listened. I heard almost nothing. A door closing somewhere behind the walled garden, a pigeon, the faint scrape of a broom on a step at the western end. "A curious thoroughfare," said Holmes, "for a murder committed with a firearm." "You are certain, then, that a firearm was employed?" "I am certain of nothing, Watson, and of many things. The fibre is cut cleanly. The coat was pierced by something travelling at no small velocity. The smell at the alley's mouth was of heated oil. These facts, taken separately, are curiosities. Taken together, they are a sentence." We began at the public house at the western end, the Black U, and worked our way east. Holmes asked each tenant the same three questions. Where had they been at 9 o'clock the previous evening? What had they heard? And had anything at all, struck them as unusual, however trifling? The publican had been behind his own bar. 4 of his patrons had been on the pavement outside, smoking and quarrelling over a horse at Newmarket. None of them had heard a report. None of them had heard a shout. The first any of them knew of the business was the constable's whistle some minutes later. At number 7, a thin man in an ink-stained collar admitted us grudgingly, and confirmed he had heard nothing beyond his own clock. At number 11, a widow who had been at her window assured Holmes with some indignation that had a pistol been discharged upon her street, she would certainly have noticed. At the boarding-house at the eastern end, the proprietress could vouch for 6 lodgers and the rattle of a kettle. No one, from one end of Galowmere Road to the other, had heard the one sound that ought, by every reasonable expectation, to have been heard. Holmes received each denial with the same small, courteous nod. Only once, outside number 11, did he permit himself a remark. 17 houses, Watson, a public house, a boarding-house, a garden wall along one flank, and not an ear in the lot of them that registered the thing. That is not silence by accident. Silence of that order is built. It was at the shop of a greengrocer 2 streets south that we found the first living thing to have noticed anything at all. The greengrocer kept a wire-haired terrier behind his counter, a small barrel-chested creature with the truculent eye of its breed. The shopkeeper, wiping his hands on his apron, remembered the previous evening quite precisely, because the dog had made such a disturbance of itself. "Barkin' fit to crack the glass, sir. Just on 9, I'd reckon, or a minute past. I come out with a broom thinking it was a fox at the bins, and there weren't nothing in the yard, nothing in the lane. Quiet as a Sunday, but he wouldn't be quieted. Hackles up, sir, and that's not his way." Holmes knelt and extended the back of his hand to the terrier, which sniffed it, and then, after a moment's consideration, permitted itself to be scratched behind the ear. "Your dog," said Holmes, rising, "is an honest witness, better than most. He had heard something the rest of the street had not." "Heard, sir? There weren't nothing to hear." "There was," said Holmes, "a very little to hear, enough for him. Not enough for you." We walked on. 2 streets further south, along a narrow service lane behind a row of respectable houses, we found a governess taking down linen from a line strung between 2 iron posts. She was a young woman with the composed face of one accustomed to not being listened to, and she answered Holmes's questions with a slight colour rising to her cheek. "Not a sound, sir. Not properly. Only—" I could not say what it was. I had been folding a sheet, and I remember I stopped. The air shifted. Shifted. As though— I know it is a foolish thing to say, sir— as though a window had opened somewhere very near and closed again. Only there was no window. It was a moment. I thought nothing of it at the time. "At what hour, madam?" "Just past 9. Holmes thanked her with a gravity that made her colour rise further, and we turned back toward the main thoroughfare. He did not speak until we had reached the corner of Galowmere Road once more. There he paused, and taking from his pocket a folded map of the district, spread it against the wall of a pillar box, and traced with his forefinger a line from a small square marked Crownridge Terrace along the neighbouring streets until the finger came to rest upon the midpoint of Galowmere. "He left his house at 9 each evening, Watson. 11 years without deviation. The route is invariant. The hour is invariant. The street, as we have seen, is a corridor without ears." Holmes's finger did not lift from the page. Our man did not need to follow Edmund Halberd. He needed only to wait for him. He folded the map with great care, as though the paper itself had become something of value, and slid it into his breast pocket. "Tonight," he said, "we shall return at 9. I wish to stand where he stood." Chapter 3. The Imperfection. The mortuary attached to the Marylebone coroner's office was a low brick building behind an iron gate, and it smelt, as such places do, of carbolic, and of something beneath carbolic that carbolic had never quite mastered. We were received by Dr. Pettigrew, the police surgeon, a short man of considerable circumference, whose waistcoat strained where it buttoned and whose professional courtesy strained where Holmes addressed him. "The matter is closed, Mr. Holmes," he said, before we had fairly crossed his threshold. "Heart failure. A stout man of 58 under strain, taking a brisk walk in cold weather. I have signed the certificate." "You have examined the overcoat?" "I have examined what required examination." "Then you will indulge me, doctor, if I examine what does not." Pettigrew's colour rose, but he led us through to the inner room. Edmund Halberd lay upon the slab under a sheet of coarse linen, and even in death his face retained the pouched, irritable look of a man accustomed to having his own way. Holmes drew back the sheet to the waist and asked, with the courtesy he reserved for those he was about to overrule, that Dr. Pettigrew produce the overcoat. It was brought. A heavy garment of black wool, still damp at the hem. Holmes spread it upon a second slab and examined the breast under the gaslight, turning the fabric this way and that until his finger came to rest upon a point on the left side, some 4 inches below the collarbone. "Here, Watson." I bent to look. A puncture, no wider than the stem of a match. The fibres about it were not frayed, but cleanly parted, as though a very hot needle had been driven through and withdrawn. There was no powder blackening upon the wool, no scorching, only the one small, perfect hole. "A moth, perhaps," said Pettigrew, without conviction. "A moth, doctor, does not work in straight lines." Holmes lifted the garment and held it against the light of the high window. The whole showed as a speck of white in the black field, and behind it, on the inner lining, an answering speck. Exit on the front, entrance on the front, the 2 apertures perfectly collinear. "A single aperture," Holmes said, "front to inner." The garment was pierced inward, and the object did not emerge from the back of the coat. It lodged in the man. He returned to the body and laid his hand upon the chest. Beneath his palm, faint against the pallor, was a bruise no larger than a shilling, and at its centre, one had to know to look, a puncture that Pettigrew had marked in his notes as a post-mortem abrasion from the cobbles. "Doctor," said Holmes very quietly, "I should like a full examination of the thorax, now." "I have signed the certificate, Mr. Holmes. I will not be instructed." "Lestrade, then," said Holmes, "will instruct you." Lestrade was fetched. He came in his usual manner, sleeves a little too long for his coat and his hat in his hand, and listened to Holmes in the corridor, with the expression of a man who has been handed a problem he did not want. But Holmes laid the overcoat before him and guided his eye to the aperture, and Lestrade, to his credit, did not argue. "Open him, Pettigrew." The examination occupied the better part of 2 hours. We withdrew to an outer room while it proceeded, and Holmes paced before the grate, his hands clasped behind him, saying nothing. When at last we were called back, Pettigrew's colour had changed. He was a man who had been prepared to be right, and was now discovering, in the coldest terms, that he had been wrong. "The sternum," he said, with a stiffness that did him some credit, "is fractured. Fragments have been driven inward. There is a tear in the pulmonary artery consistent with a projectile of small calibre, deformed on impact. The hemorrhage was internal and catastrophic. Death, I should now estimate, within 20 seconds. Lestrade was staring at the slab. "Shot," he said, "in Galowmere Road, at 9 in the evening." "Shot," said Holmes. Pettigrew produced from a shallow enamel tray the object he had extracted. It lay upon the tray as a misshapen flower of lead, scarcely larger than a garden pea, its nose mushroomed outward where it had struck bone. Small calibre, soft lead. Made, one felt at once, not to pass through a man, but to stop within him. Holmes took it up and turned it between his fingers, and something like a private pleasure passed across his features, the cold pleasure, I had learned, of a hypothesis meeting its evidence halfway. "Small," he said, "slow, and very quiet indeed." Lestrade had recovered himself. "Quiet, Mr. Holmes? A pistol is a pistol. If a shot had been fired on Galowmere Road at 9 o'clock, the whole of the street would have heard it." "The whole of the street did not hear it, Lestrade. That is precisely the difficulty." Holmes laid the bullet back upon its tray with the delicacy of a jeweller. 17 houses, a public house, a boarding house, a governess 2 streets over who felt, rather than heard, the passage of the round, a terrier that barked at a report the human ear could not register, and a puncture in a heavy woolen coat, without scorching, without blackening, without the slightest signature of a close discharge. He turned to the inspector with a face grown, in those few seconds, very grave indeed. "Someone, Lestrade, has shot a man to death in the middle of a London street, and arranged that no one should know a shot had been fired. Not even the dead man. Not even you." Lestrade looked down at the small flower of lead upon the tray, and said nothing at all. Outside, the rain had begun again in earnest. We walked back toward Baker Street through it without speaking. Holmes kept his hand in his pocket, and I believe, though I cannot prove it, that his fingers were closed about the bullet the whole of the way. Chapter 4. The Men Who Wanted Him Dead. "A man who is murdered upon a public street," said Holmes the following morning, as he buttered his toast with a patience I found unnerving, "has commonly given a great many persons a great many reasons to desire it. Our difficulty, Watson, will not be a shortage of candidates. It will be the opposite." By midday he had produced from the ledger of a city solicitor who owed him a favour, and from the back pages of 3 newspapers, a list long enough to humble any investigation. He crossed out names with the economy of a man pruning a hedge. By 2 o'clock we were left with 4. Mrs. Clara Halberd received us in a drawing-room at Crown Ridge Terrace, so deliberately cold that I kept my coat upon my knees. She was a woman of 31, fair in a pale and economical way, and her black dress had been fetched, one felt, from a press where it had been waiting some time. She did not weep. She did not pretend to. She offered us tea in the voice of a woman reading a household list. "You will wish to know where I was at 9 o'clock, Mr. Holmes. I was in this room, reading. Hannah brought coals at 1:15. Mrs. Keene came to ask about tomorrow's meet at 20 to 10. The constable called at 11. That is the whole of my evening. You do not grieve, madam. I do not lie, sir. My husband was a cruel man to live beside. His death has made me a widow and has made me rich. I should be a worse hypocrite than he was, to pretend one without the other." Holmes inclined his head and asked nothing further. In the hansom he remarked only, "She answers like a woman telling the truth, Watson. Liars embroider. She gave us no thread at all." Thomas Reed we found at a coffee-house near Blackfriars, and his temper was of the kind that fills a room before he does. He was a great black-bearded fellow in a suit cut for a narrower man, and he had been drinking beer at that early hour with the grim commitment of the recently dismissed. Halberd is dead, and I shan't feign a tear for him. He had me turned off a corporation contract on a lie, and saw to it I'd not work in London again. I told him in the Caledonian Club, before 6 gentlemen, that he would answer for it. I'll tell you the same, Mr. Holmes, and save you the trouble of asking. Where were you at 9 o'clock, Mr. Reed? Walking, in that district, looking for a man I know keeps rooms thereabouts who might stand me a job. I found him not, and I walked home. Prove me otherwise if you can. Holmes regarded him a long moment. Have you, Mr. Reed, ever handled a firearm? I've shot a rook with a keeper's gun, if that signifies. I am a builder, sir. I work in timber and stone. We left him paying for his beer with a handful of coppers counted twice. Elias Crowe was the opposite man entire. We found him at his lodgings in Pentonville, a small and pinched clerk of 40 with damp palms, and a collar darkened where his neck had sweated into it. He had been Halberd's accountant for 11 years. At the first of Holmes's questions he attempted an answer. At the second he gave a different answer. At the third he began to shake so visibly that Watson, I confess it, placed a hand upon his sleeve for fear he would overset the lamp. I was at Holborn, sir. No, I'd gone to... Oh, God, what does it matter? You know already, don't you? You must know. I know nothing yet, Mr. Crowe. What is it you believe I know? But Crowe had collapsed forward, with his hands over his face, and the little we extracted from him in the following quarter hour concerned a matter not of murder, but of arithmetic, a slow 2-year theft of small sums from his employer's ledgers, concealed by transfers of remarkable cleverness. He wept over it as a man weeps over a thing he has lived beside too long. Of his whereabouts at 9 o'clock he would say nothing, only, over and over, that he had needed Mr. Halberd to live. A truthful remark, Holmes observed as we descended to the street. One does not kill the goose whose eggs one is still counting. Crowe is a thief, Watson, not a murderer. He is terrified of the wrong discovery. The fourth name was one I had not heard before, Victor Langley. Holmes had spent 2 hours tracing him, and at last we found him in a rented room above a watchmaker's shop in Pimlico, up a narrow stair that smelt of beeswax and clock oil. He opened the door himself, a man in his middle 40s, lean upright, with hair gone iron grey at the temples, and a stillness about him that I can only describe as the stillness of a man who has long been alone in rooms. He wore a plain dark suit, well kept. He received us with a grave courtesy that would not have disgraced a regimental mess. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please. The chair by the window, doctor, is the sounder of the two. Will you take tea? We declined. He made tea for himself. He answered Holmes's questions without haste and without excess. Where had he been the previous evening? At the Westminster Reading Room, from 9:30 until the hour of 11. The attendant would confirm it. He had signed the register, as was required. Had he known Mr. Halberd? He had. Mr. Halberd had, 2 years previously, acquired a tract of land upon which the Langley family had lived for 3 generations. By means Mr. Langley would characterize as fraudulent, and had turned them out of it. His brother, he added without inflection, had not survived the winter that followed. You had cause to hate him then. I had cause, Mr. Holmes, to consider him a blight. Hatred is a warm feeling. I have not felt warm about Mr. Halberd for some time. Holmes asked nothing further. We took our leave. Langley saw us to the stair with the same grave courtesy, and closed the door behind us without haste. In the hansom, I confess I was surprised at Holmes's silence. At last I said, "A cold fish, that one." But he answered every question. "Yes," said Holmes, looking out at the passing street. "He answered every question. That is precisely what troubles me, Watson. An innocent man stumbles. A guilty one has rehearsed." That night, at Baker Street, he opened his pocket-book and wrote 4 names upon a fresh page. He considered them for some moments. Then he drew a careful circle, not about Langley, not about Crowe, not about Clara Halberd. He drew it about the name of Thomas Reed. Chapter 5. The Scent of Machinery. Holmes was not at breakfast. I found, upon the sideboard, a note in his hand. gone to the Corporation Archive. Do not wait. Meet me in Galowmere at 9:15. S.H. I read it twice, finished my coffee, and spent the intervening hours in a state of inactivity that suited neither of us. At 8:30 I took a cab. The rain had ceased at last, and a low river fog was rising in its place, thickening the gaslight into soft amber globes along the curbs. Galowmere Road at that hour had, if anything, less life about it than by day. The public house at the west end was shuttered against the damp. The walled garden to the north was a black length without feature. A single cat walked the pavement and did not look up at me as it passed. Holmes was already there. He stood at the midpoint of the road precisely where Edmund Halberd had fallen, and his face was turned a little toward the north side of the street. When I came up beside him, he did not greet me. He lifted a hand for quiet. I closed my mouth and listened. The silence of the place was, as he had said the day before, of a constructed sort. A hansom passed along the street that crossed at the eastern end, and its sound was at once absorbed. A door shut at number 9, and the shutting was small and muffled. A voice called somewhere beyond the garden wall, and the voice did not carry. I understood, standing there, what Holmes had meant by a corridor of privacy. Galowmere Road was not quiet by accident. The architecture of the block, the wall, the setback of the houses, the absence of mews, had made of it a long, soft pocket into which sound fell and did not return. 9 o'clock, said Holmes, so low that I scarcely heard him. He came from there. He gestured without turning his head toward the east. He walked precisely here. He passed within 8 yards of the alley's mouth. He was not hurried. He did not look aside. He had walked this stretch 6 nights in every 7 for 11 years, and he no longer saw it. And the killer? Holmes did not answer at once. He drew a slow breath through his nose, and then a second, and on the second his eyes half closed. There, he said. You have it again, Watson, do you not? I breathed as he had breathed. For a moment there was only damp stone and the far smell of coal smoke, and then, beneath these, fainter than before but unmistakably present, the thin, hot, unclean scent I had noticed by the body on the first morning. Burnt oil on metal. It is stronger tonight, said Holmes, because the air is still. By morning it had been dispersed, but it is of a kind that persists. The oil was worked into the stone, not merely deposited upon it. Come. He crossed to the northern pavement in 3 long strides and entered the mouth of the alley between the walled garden and the flank of the boarding house. It was an ill-paved cleft some 4 feet across, unlit, its walls rising to twice a man's height. I followed, striking a lucifer for him. He took the little flame from my fingers without a word and bent it toward the ground. The alley ran perhaps 15 yards before turning sharply to the right. 8 paces from its mouth against the base of the garden wall was a dark stain upon the stones, fresh enough to have caught my thumbnail when I touched it, tacky still beneath a film of grit. Holmes lowered the match until it hovered an inch above the stain. Here. He set a heated implement upon the flag, briefly, and lifted it again, not long enough to char the stone, long enough to leave the residue. He was standing, facing outward. Holmes rose and turned smoothly upon his heel until he faced the street. His shoulder almost brushed the wall. From where he stood, the midpoint of Galowmere Road, the precise spot where Halberd had fallen, lay framed between the alley's black jambs as in the aperture of a camera. The gas lamp at the corner threw its light across that spot and nowhere nearer. A man standing in this alley would see the pavement as a stage. A man upon the pavement would see nothing in this alley at all. 7 yards, said Holmes softly. Perhaps 8. He could not have missed a stationary man at that range. He did not miss. The lucifer burned my fingers and I dropped it. Holmes struck another from his own case without remark, and in the renewed light he crouched slowly toward the mouth of the alley, where the pavement met a cast-iron drainage grate rusted at its edges. He set the flame close to the grate. He held it there a long moment. Then, with the tweezers he had carried upon him these 2 days, he reached between the bars and lifted out something that caught the light as he raised it. A small object, circular, no larger than the nail of his smallest finger, of dull brass. He turned it in the matchlight. It was threaded at its rim, and its inner edge was beveled in a way I had not seen upon any fastening in a domestic house. A small, careful, machined thing, the work of a man to whom 1,000th of an inch was a unit of ordinary meaning. "What is it, Holmes?" "A component." "Of what?" He did not answer. He wrapped the brass object in a square of paper, slid the paper into his note-case, and rose. "Tonight," he said, "I shall not sleep, Watson. I have a good deal to read and 1 or 2 persons to visit who are not easy to find. You, however, have earned your bed. Go to it." We walked back toward the cab stand. At the mouth of the alley, Holmes paused and looked once more toward the spot on the pavement where Edmund Halberd had fallen forward, with his cane pitched ahead of him. "He stood exactly here," Holmes said, to no one in particular. He had rehearsed this stand. He had perhaps stood in this alley upon other nights, at this hour, without firing, simply to be certain of the geometry and the sound. And when at last he fired, he did not hurry. Observe the oil, Watson. A man in a panic does not set down a hot thing carefully enough to leave a stain of so exact a shape. I looked at him. His face in the lamplight was the face of a man who has understood the size, if not yet the name, of his adversary. "He is a craftsman," Holmes said. "That is the worst of it. He is a patient, deliberate craftsman, and he has made, for the purpose of this murder, a tool." Chapter 6. The Wrong Man. I slept badly and rose to find the morning's papers upon the breakfast table already open to the middle page. Holmes, fully dressed and with the air of a man who had not been to bed at all, pushed the Standard across to me without comment. I read the paragraph twice to be sure of it. Arrest in the Galowmere Road affair. Inspector G. Lestrade of Scotland Yard announces the detention of Mr. Thomas Reed, builder, of Blackfriars, in connection with the death of Mr. Edmund Halberd. It is understood that Mr. Reed had publicly threatened the deceased within recent weeks, was in the district on the evening in question, and possesses the mechanical training consistent with the unusual manner of the crime. A speedy resolution is anticipated. Lestrade has been busy, I said. Lestrade has been relieved, said Holmes. There is a difference. He has had a crime upon his ledger that he did not wish to keep, and he has now set it down upon someone else. The papers will applaud him before noon and forget him by evening, and Thomas Reed will hang in 6 weeks. Unless. He did not finish the sentence. He folded his napkin, took up his hat, and we went out. Reed was being held in a cell at the Marlborough Street station. We were admitted by a sergeant who had been reading of the arrest in his own paper, and who wore in consequence the small smugness of men near great events. He led us down a flagged corridor, unlocked a heavy door, and stood aside. Reed sat upon the edge of a plank bench with his great hands upon his knees, and he looked for the first time in our acquaintance smaller than his suit. The truculence had gone out of him. What remained was a tired, black-bearded man who could not quite believe that the walls about him were real. "Mr. Holmes, you've come to see the show, have you?" "I have come to ask you one question, Mr. Reed. If you answer it truthfully, I shall trouble you no further. If you do not, I shall trouble you the more." "Ask it, then." "Have you ever, in the course of your life, handled a firearm that had been modified for silence?" Reed stared at him. I watched his face carefully, as Holmes had taught me to watch such faces, and I could see in it no movement of guilt nor of evasion, only a plain and tired incomprehension. "Modified for—" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Mr. Holmes, I could not tell you what such a thing would look like. I am a builder. I know the weight of a hammer, and the set of a dovetail, and the proper mix of a lime mortar. I have shot a rook with a keeper's piece. I have never seen a pistol fitted with whatever it is you are describing, and I should not know how to fit one if I had it in my hand for a fortnight. Thank you, Mr. Reed. Is that all?" "That is all." We left him sitting upon the bench with his hands upon his knees. In the corridor, Holmes walked past the sergeant without a glance, and did not speak until we were upon the street, where the fog had thinned to a thin grey wash, and a boy was crying the midday edition with the word "Arrest!" printed in a type so large it could be read across the road. "You believe him," I said. I believed him within the first sentence of his answer, An innocent man, Watson, is clumsy about his innocence. A guilty man would have known at once what I meant, and would have been careful in denying it. Reed did not know what I meant. He had to find his way into the question before he could find his way out of it. Then you will tell Lestrade. I will not. I stopped upon the pavement. Holmes. Not yet, Watson. Consider the matter. Our quarry has, until this moment, believed himself safe. He read of the natural causes verdict on the first morning, and was satisfied. He learned of the internal examination, and was no doubt less satisfied. But now, this morning, he reads of the arrest of Thomas Reed, and he is once again at ease. Men at ease make errors. Men who believe themselves pursued make none. I should like, for the next several days, for him to continue reading what the Standard is pleased to print. And Reed? Reed will spend a very unpleasant week. I'm sorry for it. He will be released with an apology from Inspector Lestrade that he will not accept, and he will tell the story of it for the rest of his life in public houses across the city, and he will be better off for the telling. He will survive, Watson. The alternative is that our quarry should survive instead. There was a cold economy in it that I could not quite bring myself to like, and Holmes, who read my silence as clearly as my speech, said no more upon the subject. We walked back to Baker Street through streets where every newsboy was shouting the same word. In the sitting room, Holmes did not sit. He went directly to his writing desk and laid upon the green leather, in a small cleared square beneath the reading lamp, the object he had taken from the drainage grate the night before. In daylight, and under the lens, it was more eloquent still. A tiny circle of brass threaded without, beveled within. Its inner face scored faintly where something had pressed upon it at speed and had pressed itself loose. Holmes turned it over and over beneath the glass, and at length he said, half to himself, "A builder does not build this, Watson. A builder shapes timber, not thousandths of an inch. Reed could no more have turned this piece upon a lathe than he could have written a sonnet. Whoever made this, whoever dropped it, hot and imperfect, from a mechanism he had assembled with his own hands, was a man trained to a tolerance a mason never touches." He lifted his head. The gaslight caught the hollows beneath his eyes and the thin, hard line of his mouth. The man we seek did not merely use a weapon, Watson, he built one. And a weapon of this sort is not built in an afternoon. It is the labour of months, of a year, of 2 years. Perhaps. It is the labour of a man with a grievance he has had the patience to tend. He was silent a long moment. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall find an old soldier I once did a service. He will tell me what this little brass thing is. And then, Watson, I think we shall know our man." Chapter 7. The Shape of Silence. The old soldier Holmes had spoken of kept a narrow shop in a court off the Strand, between a bookbinder's and a tobacconist's, with no name above the door, and a window so blackened by coal smoke that one had to know it was there to find it. A small bell rang as we entered. The shop smelt of gun oil and the dry spice of old leather, and along its walls, in locked glass presses, lay the implements of a trade that had mostly retired with its owner: service revolvers, a pair of elephant guns, a row of sporting rifles oiled and racked as regimental arms. Collingwood himself came through a curtain at the back. He was a spare man of 70, white-moustached, upright in the manner of one who had spent 40 years standing to attention and had forgotten how to do otherwise. He and Holmes exchanged the small courtesies of men who had, at some time in the past, been of use to one another and had not forgotten it. "A question, Collingwood." "Ask it, Mr. Holmes." Holmes laid upon the glass counter the brass object he had carried in a paper fold for 2 days. Collingwood took up a loop from beside the till, clipped it to his eye, and bent to the counter. He did not speak. For the better part of a minute he did not even move. When at last he straightened, he did so slowly. And he set down the loop with the particular care a man employs when his hands are not entirely steady. "Where did you find this, sir?" "In a drainage grate, off Galowmere Road, 2 nights ago." "Then a man is dead." "A man is dead." Collingwood drew a long breath through his nose, and looked once at the blackened window, as though collecting from it the answer he did not wish to give. "It is a baffle, Mr. Holmes, an internal baffle, from a suppression device fitted about the muzzle of a firearm to deaden the report of its discharge. The pattern is not a pattern I should care to see upon a counter in London. It is a military pattern. Specifically, It is the Whitcomb pattern of 83. Explain. In the campaigns of the early 80s, there was a body of work done, quietly, sir, and under seal, upon the silencing of firearms for the use of scouts and reconnaissance parties in the colonial theatres. The object was to shoot a sentry without alerting his company. The work was never brought into general service. The mechanisms fouled in dust, and the ammunition required was peculiar, but the designs exist. The designs were carried home in the heads of the men who had been taught them, and in no other place. The Whitcomb baffle is the second stage element. It catches the gas behind the leading disc and spreads it laterally before release. That is what gives the weapon the quiet you have read of. Without this small piece of brass, Mr. Holmes, the device is only a noisy pistol with a long nose. With it, it is something else. How many men in England would recognise this baffle for what it is? 80. Perhaps 100. How many would know the building of it? 20. At the outside. Holmes set his hand upon the counter. I should like, Collingwood, the names. There was a pause. Collingwood was not a man who gave names readily, and Holmes had not expected him to be. But a murder upon a London street has a weight that the privacies of the regimental mess cannot entirely withstand, and the old soldier, after a further consultation of the blackened window, went through his curtain and returned with a small pocket-book bound in calf. He turned to a page near its end. He read from it without passing it across. 20 were taught, 4 are dead, 2 in India, 1 at sea, 1 I attended the funeral of myself last spring. 12 are abroad on service or in retirement in the colonies. Of those remaining in England, there are 3. Colonel Hargrave, who has not left Bath in 7 years, and cannot lift his right hand above his waist. Major Whitcomb himself, who designed the pattern, and who is 81 and bedridden in Sussex. And 1 other, a sapper captain of the Bengal establishment, retired 8 years. Victor Langley. Holmes did not start. He did not exclaim. He did not, I think, even allow himself the small satisfaction of a drawn breath. He only stood upon the flagged floor of that dim shop with his hands clasped behind him, and after a long moment he inclined his head to Collingwood, with a formality that was almost regimental in itself. You have been of great service. I shall not need to trouble you again. Mr. Holmes? Yes. If the man you are hunting is the man I think you are hunting, you will find that he has thought of everything. He was a very thorough officer. Have a care, sir. I shall. We walked out into the court and thence to the Strand, where the traffic of the afternoon was at its height, and the noise of it struck me like a sound I had been too long without. I kept pace with Holmes in silence for perhaps 100 yards before I trusted myself to speak. Langley. Langley! But the reading-room register places him there at 9:30, Watson. Not at 9. Not at 9 and 8 minutes. Between the one moment and the other lies an interval of 2 and 20 minutes, and if you and I could not make use of 2 and 20 minutes, Captain Langley assuredly could. He is a sapper, Watson, a builder of bridges under fire, a man trained to accomplish a precise task within a precise window while being shot at. 2 and 20 minutes in a quiet district of London was, for such a man, an extravagance of time. Then why did you not press him at the interview? Because I had nothing then to press him with. I had a dead man, an odd hole in a coat, a faint smell of oil. I had no brass, Watson. I had no Collingwood. I had only a stillness in a man's manner that might have been the stillness of grief as easily as the stillness of a guilty conscience. I could not arrest a man for answering my questions calmly. I can, however, arrest a man who built this. He drew out the small brass baffle and held it up between thumb and forefinger, and in the grey daylight of the Strand it caught a thin line of light along its machined rim. He built the weapon, Watson. He chose the street. He chose the hour. He chose the range, and he chose the cartridge. And he chose the evening on which to fire. All of this he did over 2 years, while the rest of London looked the other way. All that remains to me is to prove he pulled the trigger. He replaced the baffle in his note-case. And that, he said, I shall do tomorrow by walking the road he walked between 9 o'clock and 9:30. Chapter 8. The 20-minute window. Holmes left Baker Street the following morning at 9:15, in an ulster of a plainer cut than he commonly affected, and with a watch borrowed from my own waistcoat because, he said, his own ran half a minute fast, and half a minute in such a matter was an indulgence he did not intend to afford himself. I went with him as far as the corner of Galowmere Road, and there he stopped and set me a station. "You will stand at this corner, Watson. You will consult your watch at 9 o'clock exactly. You will walk at an ordinary pace, not a hurried one, the route a man takes from the midpoint of Galowmere Road to the door of the Westminster Reading Room. You will consult your watch again as you arrive. You will not quicken, and you will not loiter. I shall do the same, by the other of the two plausible routes. We shall meet at the reading room and compare." And what are we proving? We are proving a margin, Watson. We are proving that a man who was at Galowmere Road at 8 minutes past 9, and who wished to be seen writing his name in a ledger at half past the hour, had neither to run, nor to sweat, nor to arrive in a state that would have drawn remark. We are proving that he had, on the contrary, a quantity of time sufficient to permit him to pause. We parted. I walked as he had bid me, neither hastening nor delaying, and I arrived at the reading room at 30 minutes past 9 precisely, which is to say, with 2 minutes in hand. Holmes was already there, standing beneath the gas bracket opposite the door, making a small correction in a pocket notebook. 2:20 minutes, he said, without greeting. The walk is 2:20. The margin for a man who fired his shot at 8 minutes past is 8 further minutes, which is to say, time enough to dismantle a device he had rehearsed the dismantling of, time to pocket the components, time to pass from the alley by a route not crossing Galowmere Road itself, and time, Watson, to pause for a glass of water. A glass of water? A glass of water. Come. He led me by a route neither direct nor circuitous. The route, he had evidently determined, of a man with a particular object. We came, some 7 or 8 minutes back along the line of march, to a small public house upon a corner, the sort of place patronised at that hour by clerks coming off late shifts and by men who did not wish to be remembered. The Bell and Compass. Holmes pushed open the door and we went in. The barmaid was a sharp-eyed young woman of perhaps 24, who looked up from the glass she was wiping and took our measure in the brief professional way of her trade. Holmes removed his hat and approached the counter with the manner of a man inquiring after an old acquaintance. "I am told," he said, "that on Monday evening last a gentleman came in upon this side of 9, a little later, perhaps, and asked for a glass of water." "Water?" She set the glass down. "Aye, I remember. A quiet gentleman, grey at the temples, kept his hat, asked me for a glass of water and set down a penny for it when I'd have given it him free, drank it standing, did not speak again, was gone inside 3 minutes. "You remarked him?" "Sir, I have served in this house 11 months, and he is the first man who has come in off the street and asked for water. Beer, gin, stout, brandy, porter, yes. Water, no. I remarked him, and I shall remark him if he comes again." "His hands, madam. Can you recall his hands?" She thought a moment. "He set the penny down with his right. His left was in his coat pocket and stayed there." "That I do recall, because I thought it queer. A gentleman does not commonly drink with one hand in his pocket." "Thank you," said Holmes very quietly. "You have been of considerable assistance, and I shall ask you not to repeat this conversation to any person whatever for a period of 3 days. After that, you may repeat it, as you please." We left. In the street, Holmes walked for some paces without speaking, his head slightly inclined as a man who has fitted the last piece of a border into a jigsaw and sees, for the first time, the shape of the picture within it. He was steadying himself, Watson. One does not ask for water unless one's throat has gone dry, and a throat goes dry in a strong man for one reason only on such a night. His left hand was in his pocket, because in his pocket, wrapped in a kerchief, was a weapon he had not yet had the privacy to dismantle fully. He had the outer casing off by the time he left the alley. The pistol and the inner elements he took with him. He stopped here because he had gauged, to the minute, that he could afford to stop, and he drank his water, and he paid his penny, and he went on to the reading room and signed the register at 9:30 with a hand that the attendant would not remark had trembled. There was, I recall, a fine drizzle beginning as he spoke, and he did not put up his collar against it. "There is one further thing, Watson, and then the picture is whole." He took me that afternoon to a small office in Gray's Inn where a clerk of his acquaintance kept, for a fee, copies of conveyances that had passed through the chancery registers of the preceding decade. Holmes asked for a particular parcel in a particular year, in the name of Halverd, and for the associated deed. The clerk brought them with the incurious efficiency of his profession. We read them together at a high desk by the window. The facts lay upon the page in the dry language of property. 2 years and 7 months earlier, a tract of land in Berkshire, upon which the Langley family had resided for 3 generations, had been acquired by Edmund Halverd through a foreclosure the legality of which, Holmes observed in a low voice, a barrister of any competence would have undone in a morning had the Langleys been able to retain one. They had not. The elder Langley had died within a month of the eviction. The younger Langley, and the sapper captain's only brother, had been found in the spring, in a coppice not 3 fields from the house that had been his, with a service revolver beside him. Holmes closed the folio slowly. 2 years, Watson. A man does not build a weapon of the sort our quarry built in a season. It is the work of winters. It is the work of evenings in a rented room above a watchmaker's shop, at a bench which smells of oil, while the landlord downstairs works his lathes below and asks no questions about the sounds that come through his ceiling. 2 years, Watson. It took him that long to build the weapon. And the waiting? Why wait 2 years once it was built? Because, Watson, a man who has constructed his instrument as carefully as our man has constructed his will not use it until he has constructed with equal care the evening on which he uses it. He waited until the fog was right, and the wind was right, and the moon was in the quarter he wanted, and the reading room register would serve him. He waited, in short, for a night that fitted the weapon. And on Monday last, such a night came. We walked out into Gray's Inn, and the drizzle was heavier now. Holmes put up his collar at last. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall call upon Captain Langley, and I think, Watson, we shall not find him surprised to see us." Chapter 9. The Engineer of Silence. We came to Pimlico in the early afternoon, by a route Holmes had chosen so that we should approach the watchmaker's shop from the southern end of the street, and should not, in the last 100 yards, pass beneath any window from which a man might observe us without our observing him in turn. 2 constables in plain coats walked some way behind us. A third was stationed at the mouth of the mews behind the shop. Holmes had arranged it all that morning with Lestrade, who had come to it at first with protest, and ended with a quiet nod. The watchmaker below was at his bench when we entered. He looked up and looked away. Holmes asked if Captain Langley was above, and the watchmaker said that he was, and that he had been above all morning, and that there had been no sound from him save once, an hour since, when he had opened a window to air the room. Holmes thanked him and went to the stair. We went up quietly, though I do not think quiet was necessary. Langley was expecting us. I understood that the moment he opened the door. He was in his shirt sleeves, which was the only irregularity in his appearance. The rest of him was as composed as he had been at our first interview. He stood aside without a word and admitted us. The room was as I remembered it. Spare, well kept, a small grate, a single shelf of books. A narrow bed made with a precision I had last seen in a regimental barrack. Upon the deal table stood a tea caddy and 2 cups, one of them used. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, will you take tea?" "I thank you, Captain Langley. I shall not." He inclined his head. He had registered the refusal, I saw precisely. He had registered also that Holmes had called him Captain. He did not remark upon either. He gestured us to the 2 chairs and took for himself a third, drawn up simply, without ceremony. Holmes did not sit at first. He crossed instead to the table and took from his breast pocket the small paper fold he had carried these 4 days. He opened it upon the deal between us. The brass baffle lay upon the paper as it had lain upon Collingwood's counter. Langley looked at it. He did not reach for it. He did not lean forward. He only looked at it for perhaps 5 seconds, and then he raised his eyes to Holmes's face and kept them there. "Please sit, Mr. Holmes." Holmes sat. I shall not set down, in any fullness, the conversation that followed. It was not of the kind that lends itself to transcription. Holmes spoke in a low and even voice, without heat, without flourish, and Langley listened without interruption, his hands resting upon his knees, in the attitude of a man hearing a report he has written himself and is now being read aloud to. Holmes laid the case down piece by piece, as one sets a service of plate upon a table. The pinhole in the coat, the cut fibre, the smell of burnt oil lingering by the alley mouth, the oil stain upon the flag where a heated mechanism had been briefly set down, the brass baffle from the drainage grate. Identified by Collingwood as a Whitcomb pattern of 83, the 20 who had been taught, and the 3 who remained in England, and the one of the 3 who had learnt the designs in India, and had come home to a family destroyed by Edmund Halbert's hand, the reading-room register at 9:30 and the 22-minute walk that lay behind it, the glass of water in the bell and compass, and the left hand kept in the coat pocket, the foreclosure, the eviction, the brother in the coppice in the spring. He spoke perhaps 8 minutes. When he finished, he did not ask a question. He waited. Langley did not speak at once. When he did, it was softly. "You are an unusual man, Mr. Holmes. I had not accounted for you. I thought of constables. I thought of coroners. I thought of every surgeon in London, and of every inspector at the yard, and I fitted my evening around each of them in turn. I did not think of you. I should have done. It was an omission of the kind I was trained not to commit. Do you deny any particular, Captain Langley?" "I deny no particular. I shall not insult you with a denial." "Do you claim, then, that what was done was justified?" Langley considered this for some moments, with the grave attention he had given to every question Holmes had put to him at our first meeting. "I claim, Mr. Holmes, that a man who destroys a family by a false deed, and who walks past its consequences for 2 years without troubling himself to learn of them, places himself beyond the reach of any remedy the courts are equipped to apply. I claim that I was the only instrument remaining. I claim also that I expected to be found, though I had hoped for a longer interval than I have received. I do not claim that what I did was justified. I claim that it was owed. That is a different word." "It is a different word," Holmes said, "but it is not a word the law recognizes." "No, I know the word the law uses." "May I ask you one question, Captain Langley, to which the answer will alter nothing, but which I shall ask none the less?" "Ask it." "Did you consider, at any stage, a confession?" Langley smiled very faintly, the first such expression I had seen upon his face in either interview. "Every day, Mr. Holmes, for 2 years, and every day I considered that a confession would have denied the object of the work. I did not build what I built in order to be heard. I built it in order not to be." Holmes rose. Langley rose also. He went to the narrow bed and knelt beside it and drew from beneath it a small leather case of the kind gentlemen used once to carry pistols for the field. He laid it upon the deal table. He opened the hasps. Within, bedded in green baize cut to its shape, lay a revolver of modest length and unusual profile, a cylindrical attachment separate in its own compartment, the remaining internal elements each in their own recess, a craftsman's case, assembled not for concealment but for order. The weapon, Mr. Holmes. Such cartridges as remain are in the paper twist beneath. The outer casing I dismantled in the alley. The inner elements I dismantled here, upon this table, between 10 and 11 that night. I did not clean the bore until the following morning. I regretted the delay. It is not a weapon one ought to leave fouled. Holmes closed the case gently and took it up. "Captain Langley, I must ask you to accompany us." "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Permit me a coat." He took his coat from the peg and put it on. He took his hat. He did not look back at the room as he followed us down the stair, and I believe, though I cannot prove it, that he had said good-bye to it some hours before we had ever knocked upon his door. In the street, Lestrade was waiting with the 2 constables. Langley gave his wrists without a word. The watchmaker below, through his darkened window, did not look up from his bench. Chapter 10. The Truth Behind the Silence. We came back to Baker Street in the early evening, by which hour the rain had drawn off and the gas lamps had been lit along the length of the road, and the fire in our sitting-room had been made up by Mrs. Hudson against our return. Holmes did not speak in the cab. He did not speak upon the stair. He hung up his coat with the care of a man who is allowing himself, for the first time in some days, to be tired, and he took his pipe from the mantel, and he sat in his chair by the fire, and for a long while he only looked into the grate. I took the chair opposite. I did not press him. I had learned over the years of our acquaintance that the hour after a case of this weight was an hour Holmes did not always wish to fill with words, and I had my own thinking to do. At length he said, "You are troubled, Watson." "I am." "About Langley?" "About all of them. About Reed, who will be released in the morning, and will never forgive Lestrade for it. About Crowe, whose 2 years of theft we have laid bare, and who will be prosecuted as our piece of domestic arithmetic. About Mrs. Halberd, who will inherit a house she plainly does not want, and will be rich in a manner she plainly does not love. And about Langley, who has answered for the killing of a man whom no court in England would have punished for the killings he committed with his pen." Holmes considered this for a long while. He drew upon his pipe once. The tobacco glowed and dimmed. "Edmund Halberd," he said, "was not a man the law could reach. He was not a man the law, as it is presently constituted, was designed to reach. He destroyed the Langleys with a signature. He would, had he lived, have destroyed a dozen such families more." Langley understood this as clearly as I understand it. Langley chose to act where the law declined to act. That he was correct in his analysis does not make him innocent of his deed. It only makes the deed more troubling. A murder committed by a fool is a simple thing, Watson. A murder committed by a just man is the hardest thing in the world. Do you think him just? "I think him," said Holmes, "a man who once was just, and who has been turned by a grief he could not digest and a law that could not help him into an instrument. An instrument is not just or unjust. It does what its maker built it to do. Langley built himself over 2 years as carefully as he built the weapon." I was silent a time. Then I said, "The cane." "Ah, you have come to the cane." "It was dropped forward. You saw it on the first morning and set it aside. A man clutching at a failing heart does not fling his cane ahead of him. You knew then, already, that first morning, that the blow had come from in front. I knew that the man had been struck, Watson. Yes. From where, I did not yet know. But the cane told me the direction, and the coat told me the instrument, and the smell told me the place, and all three together told me, before I had left Galowmere Road, that I was not looking at a death by nature. The rest was only labour. And the governess? Yes. The governess's phrase was the most telling single word we had in the first 2 days. The air shifted. A round fired at an ordinary velocity would have produced, in that street, a sound no governess could have ignored. A round fired at a velocity below the speed of sound produces no such sound at all, only a small disturbance of the air at close range, felt rather than heard, as she described it. Had any reader of the morning papers known what her sentence meant, the physics of the crime might have been solved from her testimony alone. No reader did know. One does not build a murder, Watson, upon the ignorance of constables. One builds it upon the ignorance of the age. And the watch. The pocket watch, said Holmes. Stopped at 9 minutes past 9. Pettigrew would have made much of it had I not cautioned him. It had stopped because Halberd had wound it carelessly that evening and its spring had reached the end of its tolerance some hours before. A man's watch, Watson, is not a witness. It is a machine, and machines fail for their own reasons. Not every detail is a clue. Some details are only details. The habit of treating them all alike is the habit that makes investigators and novelists of very uneven quality. He smiled very briefly at the small point, and then the smile went out of him. He reached to the little table beside his chair and took up, from a square of paper, the brass baffle. He turned it between his thumb and forefinger, as he had turned it in Collingwood's shop and in the court off the Strand, and beside the drainage grate in which it had lain. Consider, Watson, what this little piece of metal represents. 2 years of labour. A lathe worked in the evenings above a watchmaker's shop. A dozen prototypes, discarded, reworked. The calculation of a velocity, the selection of a cartridge, the testing, I should imagine, in some sheltered place in the country where the report, such as it was, would not draw remark. The learning of a man's habits, the pacing of a street at night, the gauging of its sound, the rehearsal of an alley. All this, Watson, for a single shot of perhaps a second's duration. Langley gave 2 years of his life to produce 1 second. Halberd gave him 2 years in which to do it, by his continuing to live in a manner that had, to Langley's mind, forfeited any claim upon any further year. You speak almost as though you admire it. I do not admire it, Watson. I recognize it. Those are different words also. The crime itself, as an act of engineering, was of the highest order. As an act of a man, it was the collapse of one. Langley did not, I think, believe in his heart that what he did was a thing he had any right to do. He believed only that there was no one else in England who would do it. He was wrong in that belief. He was wrong to act upon it, and he is now in a cell at the Yard because of both errors. But one does not dismiss a man's reasoning merely because his conclusion is criminal. One examines it. That is our occupation, Watson. It is why we receive no thanks for it. He rose. He crossed to his writing desk. He opened the small wooden box in which he kept the physical remnants of cases brought to their close, a collection I had often observed and never catalogued, and he laid the brass baffle within it. Upon the paper fold it had travelled in, and he closed the lid. He stood a moment with his hand upon the lid. Silence is not the absence of sound, Watson. It is the deliberate removal of it. A man who removes a thing deliberately leaves, by the act of removing, the outline of what he has taken away. Langley removed the sound of a shot. He could not remove the shape of its removal. He is a great craftsman. He is not, as no craftsman is, a greater craftsman than the material upon which he works. He returned to the fire. He took up his pipe again. He did not speak again that evening, nor did I require it of him. Outside, upon Baker Street, the gas lamps burned against the October fog, and somewhere in the city Victor Langley sat upon a plank bench in a cell whose walls, for the first time in 2 years, were not of his own making.